Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Mark Pezarro, and I'm with City University of Seattle in Canada, which is a bit of a mouthful. We just call it City U in Canada, which is a bit more tractable. And so I'm going to talk about Arden Henley, who's the founder of GTEC, thought it would be interesting to have my story, which is how I started off I'm an Alberta boy. I was born in, well, actually, I was brought up in Alberta. We'll get into that. And then moved into sustainability over the course of my career. So that's why it's called From Oil Brat to Sustainability Champion. I guess if I stand over here, then I'll keep getting in the way of the lights. So, how did I get started? Well, obviously, of course, I have parents, and this is my mom and dad up here in the top left corner, when they just shortly after they got married. And I think this is my brother Tim, so he can attest. Well, he'll tell you if I tell him he lies. Yeah, the fact check, that's right. So I would say my parents were iconoclastic. They were principled and they were pioneers. My father was a mining engineer in southern Africa, and then my mother was a librarian. They got married when she was 19. He was 25. And my father detested apartheid. And so after they got married, they decided to leave South Africa. And we went, well, I wasn't there yet. They went, he got a job in Papua New Guinea as a seismic chief. So he was looking for oil in the jungles of Papua. And my mother stayed in Port Moresby, and I was born there. So I'm actually Papuan by birth. And my father, one of the ways he demonstrated his being principled is he was in the oil industry. We were in Calgary during the national, if somebody will remember the national energy policy, where our current Prime Minister's father brought that into being, and it really annoyed is an understatement, Albertans. And so Petro-Canada at that time had its headquarters in Calgary, in downtown Calgary, and there was a building, it's a beautiful building, it's kind of a rose-colored building. And so it was nicknamed by the locals Red Square, right? So my father, who worked, that was his community, he was very much a well-established oilman, but he voted Liberal all his life. I mean, he was probably one of the few. And he was honest about it, but he was such a good geophysicist that people still talk to him, but just agree to disagree, kind of like in Quebec, if in many families, half the family is separatist and half the family is federalist, and you just don't talk about it, sort of like that. Anyway, so that was my mother was an extraordinary woman. She took up yoga in the 1960s, long before it became fashionable, and started teaching yoga then, much to the horror of my siblings, because it wasn't very fashionable. And in fact, in Calgary, my mother had a show on the Shaw Cable Community Channel. And particularly our sister, older of our two sisters, she was mortified. She was a teenager, so her mother cavorting on TV in leotards was not cool. Anyways, and in fact, some people called my mother a witch. Albertans are quite conservative, right? It's the Bible Belt. Anyways, I went off to England to do my postgraduate work at Cambridge, which is quite a different academic and social milieu, and that had a dramatic effect on me. I took up dance, modern dance, things like that. Anyways, it changed my worldview, and I came back to Canada and worked first in IT for 10 years, and did my first startup back in, 1983, on the bleeding edge of technology. So we were too far. We were building a multimedia workstation back in 1983. Before the advent of the internet, we had to design everything ourselves, both the hardware and the software. My brother Tim actually was one of our junior engineers on the hardware team. We built prototypes, and they worked, but they were too expensive, and there was one of the cyclical downturns in the computer industry, and we went under. So that was my first startup and my first failure. Then I went to work for Shaw many years later as president of Star Choice, which became Shaw, their satellite division, Shaw Direct, and that was a successful startup. So we had lots of money, we had a good business plan, and they now have about 1 million customers. So very successful. Then I went to TELUS, and I led the development of TELUS TV, which is their answer to Shaw going into the phone business. And that was another startup, well-financed by TELUS and very successful. And then I also did another IT startup, which was to develop something that's sort of a precursor to Dropbox, for those of you who are familiar. So it's file sharing over the internet. I was the CEO. We were undercapitalized. Hi, Gil. And that failed. So I've done 2 successful startups and 2 failures. And they say that you learn more from your successes than from your failures, which I think in my case is true. The biggest success is my children. This is me down in the lower corner with my 3 children, who are thriving millennials. And at the age of 50, I'm 66, I had a midlife, well, my friends say I had a midlife crisis. I decided to go into sustainability because at TELUS, they had an executive development program, and one of the programs I did was called Leadership Vancouver, which was to train you how to be a leader in the not-for-profit sector. And I felt very blessed and wanted to give back, and so I took this program, and one of the learning days was on sustainability. This is back in 2003 or 2002. I was captivated by the notion that you could actually, that the Earth had a carrying capacity and that you should try and live within it. And that there was a whole body of scientific work and research all dedicated to how could you do that, right? So when I left TELUS, I thought, what am I going to do next? And I decided to go into sustainability. So I founded a company called Earth Voice Strategies, a consultancy, and mostly worked on the business case for sustainability. In other words, how can you demonstrate that a sustainability project will make money as well as be environmentally responsible and socially responsible? The so-called triple bottom line. Because it's a lot easier to raise money for a sustainability initiative if there is a financial advantage in addition to the social and environmental one. So that was something I was good at. That's what I did. That's how I met Gil over here, who founded a company called Frogfile, yes, thank you, Gil, which was a green office supplies company. And we became friends. We're still friends, remarkably. And he's still in the environmental business, so that's another story. Anyway, so then I'm now engaged in my 5th startup. I think of it as, which is to be launching the City University Bachelor's in Management degree here in Vancouver. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. So it's a startup but it's in the class of the ones that I've been successful with. It's part of it's a new initiative of a larger institution, so it's got money behind it. I don't have to find the money. The money's there. Just have to convince the owners, in this case the senior administration, that it's worth investing money in, which I'm good at. That I can do. Raising money from outside investors is not perhaps my strong suit. Anyways, so that's how I got into sustainability. Starting from the roots in the oil patch, but it's largely due to the influence, I would say, of my mother and father, because my father he was like I am. He was a blue, what they call a blue liberal, so he was fiscally conservative but socially progressive. And so I had that very strong influence on me. My mother she always voted NDP. My father sort of mildly appalled my father, but he adored her. So anyway, so my mother was very progressive. And so as I got older, I learned more about the way the world worked. I became convinced that capitalism was in need of repair. And so I now call myself a progressive capitalist. So I think capitalism is a good model, but it needs to be, it needs to evolve into something that takes into account not just the the fiscal bottom line or the economic bottom line, but also social and environmental consequences and impacts and so on. So, what is sustainability? Well, the definition I like as a business person turned academic is that it's the ability to operate and perform well over the long term through a business model that enhances financial prosperity, reduces environmental impact, and increases the contribution to the surrounding community. So this is popularly known as people, planet, and profits. So you have to improve all three, not just the financial one, for example. And it's now become the core strategy for the world's most forward-thinking companies, which we'll talk about. And those companies realize that in the long term, if you have a long-term view, a sustainable approach is actually the best one. It's going to produce the most shareholder value. But even more importantly, I love this quote, there's no business to be done on a dead planet. This comes from David Brower, who is regarded as the father of the modern environmental movement. He was the first executive director of the Sierra Club. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize twice. Like, he's a real icon in the sustainability environmental movement. But I think this quote, it says it all, right? Like, so if you have a long-term view as a business person, then you've got to do something about sustainability. One of my heroes is a gentleman called Paul Hawken. Paul Hawken is an American. In 1994, he published a book called The Ecology of Commerce, which has many fascinating facts, and the one that hit me when I read it, and it's such a powerful book. It was one of the books that Gordon Campbell, our past premier, read, and that made him embrace sustainability and take on introducing, a real climate change strategy for the province of BC. It also influenced Ray Anderson, who is the founder of Interface Carpet, which is a sustainable carpet manufacturer, and he's since deceased. But he read The Ecology of Commerce, and he said, "Oh my God, we have to do business differently." But one of the facts that I still remember from The Ecology of Commerce is that in 1994, when it was written in North America, in order to support our lifestyle as North Americans, it required the extraction of 1 million pounds of raw materials every year, of which 98% ended up in the landfill. In the landfill. So the waste is just staggering, right?
That's per person.
Per person in North America. Canadians and Americans, not Mexicans. Yeah.
Per person. Can you repeat that number again?
1 million pounds. So divided. So in tons, that's what? 200 tons, U.S. imperial tons. So, think about how much space that would take if it was on your lot. It would cover your property several times over, right? Every year. And most of it just goes into the landfill. It's been reduced a bit, but still, it's a real problem. Then he co-authored a book called Natural Capitalism. So he, being smarter than me, realized that capitalism had to evolve, and he wrote this book in 2008 with Amory and Hunter Lovins, who were the co-founders with him of the Rocky Mountain Institute, a very fabled sustainability research institution in Colorado. And then in 2014, he founded Project Drawdown, which is about what can we actually do to start taking CO2 out of the air. So if you want to, it's very interesting, like it's practical things, like what can you actually do to start making an impact, both individually and societally. It's fascinating work. And I heard him speak in 2014 at Pioneers. He gave the keynote address, and he said, look, we can solve this. Actually, it wasn't 2014 at the time, it was 2004. That's when I got into sustainability. He said, the solutions are within our grasp. We don't need to invent anything new. What we have to do is we have to consume less. It doesn't mean that we have to go back to living in grass huts or, caves, but we just have to give up conspicuous consumption. And then we have to develop innovative technology, clean technology to reduce our carbon footprint, and all these things. So technology is definitely part of the better transportation technology and so on. It's part of the solution. And then the last one was we need to empower women so that they educate them, make them financially independent so that they can decide how many children they want. Because when you do that, if you look at the so-called first world or developed world, they have, what's the birth rate? It's 2 or under 2. So those are the 3 levers, and he said that in 2004. I think he's still right. This is what you have to do. It's that simple. It takes a lot of political will. That's, in my view, the biggest problem. But we know what to do. You don't actually have to invent any new technology. So why is this important? Why are people suddenly getting concerned about that? Well, there's something that people have realized is that there's a so-called climate tipping point. So, and what that is a threshold. When you exceed this increase in on average global temperature, then it will precipitate major changes in the global climate system. And the IPCC, which is the International Panel on Climate Change, in 2018 warned that if the global average temperature goes more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, so in the late 1800s, then it will likely lead to runaway climate warming of something like 4 to 5 degrees centigrade increase before you reach a new equilibrium. And that's their best estimate. Like, they don't know for sure, but that's their best estimate. And now what does that mean? Well, a 4 to 5 degrees centigrade rise would probably lead to increase in sea levels. Well, it will lead to increase in sea levels for sure, somewhere between 10 and 60 meters. Now, 60 meters is 200 feet. So if you live on the coast, just think about that. Like all of Delta and all of Richland would be underwater. Manhattan would be underwater. And huge areas of Asia and Africa and South America, mostly where poorer people live, would be underwater. So this would cause somewhere between 300 and 500 million people to lose their homes, conservatively. And then what happens? They become displaced. You think we have a bad refugee problem right now? It would become an order of magnitude at least worse. Which is why the Pentagon takes climate change very seriously. And they have for over a decade, because they can see this. They're just thinking strategically, what do you have to do to preserve to avoid a clear and present danger to the United States of America, and they see climate change as a clear and present danger. If only their commander-in-chief would listen to them, but that's another topic. So there are key feedback mechanisms that will happen when the temperature rises, like you'll get forest dieback, loss of polar ice, decreased carbon sinks in the forests, in the ocean. The permafrost melts, which reduces methane, which is 20 to 30 times worse than CO2 in terms of the greenhouse gas effect. Anyway, so this is why this is so serious, because you start to go into uncharted territory. It's also predicted that at that increase in temperature, the Greenland ice cap will melt quickly. Now, if the Greenland ice cap melts quickly, it will likely stop the Gulf Stream. This has happened before in the Earth's 3 billion year history. And what does that mean? It means that the temperature, average temperature in Europe will probably go down 4 to 5 degrees centigrade. And you just imagine the impact that will have on their agriculture. It will be devastating. So there's these kinds of effects that people are concerned about. The people who pay attention, people who believe in science. If you look at Canada as a northern country is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world. And northern Canada, and also would be northern Russia, are heating at almost 3 times the global average. So the government of Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, just released a report a few months ago saying that our average annual temperature has increased, all over land has increased 1.7 degrees, in the north 2.3 degrees, and the world's average annual temperature has only increased 0.8. So we, in the north, it's even worse than the global average. Then there's also another thing that's happening. So we now live in what's called the Anthropocene era because the impact of our species is so great that it's altering the climate and many other things. So we were changing the Earth's ecosystems more rapidly than during any comparable period of time in human history. And Professor Sarah Otto is a professor in the UBC in the Biodiversity Research Center. And she put it very bluntly: human activity is driving species change. And particular rate of species loss is 1,000 times higher than in the pre-Anthropocene era. So we are driving species, our activities are driving species into extinction 1,000 times the normal rate before we became so numerous and so technologically powerful. And the problem is the rate of change, because animals and plants can adapt if change is slow, and they have for millions of years. But if it happens too fast, they can't adapt and they die out. So in last year, the World Wildlife Foundation bought out their Living Planet report, and they estimated, the scientists who did that 60% of mammals, birds, fish, and reptiles have been wiped out by human activity since 1970. I mean, this is a staggering number, 60%. This is equivalent to emptying the continents of North America, South America, Africa, Europe, and Oceania of all animal life. And then this is earlier this year, the ISPBS, which is a sister organization to the IPCC. I always have to remember, never remember what it means. It's called the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Only the UN would come up with a name like that. Bless them. Yes. But anyways, they did a major assessment, and they estimate that 1 million of the 1.8 million known species are at risk of extinction due to human activity. So that's 60% of species. And many scientists believe that we're facing the 6th mass extinction. There have been 5 in the history of our planet. The last one was when the asteroid hit the Yucatan and wiped out the dinosaurs. But it'll be the first one caused by a single species, us. And they estimate that it would take, if we stopped doing what we're doing today, mended our ways, it would take 5 to 1 million years for the natural world to recover. That's the extent of the damage that's already happened. So the destruction of biodiversity is as dangerous as climate change. So that's the problem that we face, and what do we do? Well, we have to become aware. One of the very useful measures of awareness is the ecological footprint. This was developed by Professor William Rees and Dr. Mathis Moacker-Nagel at UBC. When I decided to go into sustainability, I knew nothing about it really. I just figured I was smart and I could learn it. So I read this book, The Ecological Footprint, and being a somewhat bold person, I called Bill Rees up and I said, explained that I wanted to move into sustainability. Could I come and have coffee with him? He said yes, somewhat to my surprise. Anyway, so I went out to UBC and we spent an hour having coffee, and I could hold my own in a conversation with him. So I thought, okay, I can actually do this, and I kept doing it. But he was a professor of geography at UBC, now retired. So what it is this notion that you can measure the impact of a person or a community or a whole nation on the environment, and you express it in terms of the amount of land, arable land, required to sustain their use of natural resources and dispose of their waste. Because that's what the ecosystem, the biosphere does, is it provides natural resources that we consume, it treats the air, it treats the waste. And simplifying greatly, today we use as a species the equivalent of 1.7 planets. Well, we only have one, right? But we are consuming natural capital. And that's what is causing all these adverse effects like biodiversity loss. And if everyone on the planet used the Earth's resources at the same rate as we do in North America, we'd actually need 5 planets. And again, we only have one. So in North America, basically what it amounts to is that we're greedy. We are over-consuming at a prodigious rate. So that's the problem. Now, what do you do about it? Well, as I said earlier, you actually, if you were a forward-thinking business, it's actually to your advantage to have to operate in a sustainable fashion. Another one of my heroes is a gentleman called Bob Willard. Bob was Vice President of Human Resources at IBM Canada. And when he retired, he decided to go into sustainability and to research what is the business case for sustainability. Being a businessman himself, he realized that that's the way to get people's attention in the business world. If you can show there's a financial benefit to behaving more responsibly, that's a much easier sell. So he did a lot of research. His book is full of footnotes and references to papers that research that he consulted. And he identified that there are 6 key advantages, 6 key payoffs to adopting a sustainable business model. So the first one, and being an HR guy, was in terms of employee benefits, so HR benefits. So it's easier to hire people. People that you do hire are more productive because they feel good about what they're doing because they're working for a company that's making a difference. And they stay with you longer. You also can save money, lower costs, and have higher efficiency, which, the business advantages are obvious, but you reduce the risk. And that's, for large corporations especially, risk management is very important, particularly if you're publicly traded, because your stock price goes up and down a lot based on the assessment of the risk of your business by the market. Also, it can offer new revenue opportunities and a competitive advantage for companies who are early adopters of sustainable measures. And it inspires innovation. Usually, to do things in a more sustainable fashion, you have to get all the different elements, departments within the company talking to each other. They can't do things the way you've always done them. So you actually have to sit down and talk with each other. What a novel idea. So it breaks down silos and increases communication. And that also is good for HR benefits. And finally, something called license to operate. Well, license to operate means that you have permission from the community to operate your business. So we'll talk about these in more detail. But anyways, he estimated that for a company that has a high number of knowledge workers, so you're using, for example, a software company or a company like Uber or Facebook or Netflix, all of these hugely profitable companies, that if you embed sustainability in your operations everywhere in a systematic fashion, you can improve your profitability by 30 to 40%. Which is a serious number. It makes people pay advantage. Well, what are some examples of this? Well, in terms of easier recruiting and higher retention, in 2006 there was an Accenture study, and 51% of Canadian CEOs said the biggest threat to their profitability was an inability to retain talent. So over half. When they talked to undergraduates, the top 2 things they were looking for was a progressive work environment and an employer who's got high standards, ethical standards, and a commitment to social responsibility. So, I noticed that in my kids. I have 3 millennials, and this is commonly said of millennials. They're more concerned, much more concerned. They're much less materialistic and much more concerned about quality of life. And that includes things like ethical standards and a commitment to sustainability. Thankfully, they're more woke than my generation. I'm a baby boomer. And this is a fascinating statistic. 78% of employees would leave their current jobs for a more environmentally friendly employer. So when you're in a war for talent, particularly, for example, companies in places like here in Vancouver in the tech industry or in Silicon Valley or in Boston and other markets like that where skilled labor is actually a shortage, this is very important. And my brother here can attest to that. He's been in the high-tech industry all his life. So it also increases productivity. Well, how? Well, for example, if you have green buildings, your people are healthier, and when they're healthier, they're more productive, right? There was a study done that showed, it estimated that green buildings could increase productivity from 7 to 15%. So that's the financial benefit of that is huge, right? It's like you got an extra 7 to 15% more employees for free. Individual and team productivity increased because people feel better about who they're working for. And there's a mantra in HR which says that productivity is 18% emotional. When you think about it, it makes sense, right? If you're pissed off at your peers or your boss or the values of the company or organization you're working for, how hard are you going to work? Not very, right? So it has a huge effect. You can reduce manufacturing costs. Simply put, waste equals squandered corporate assets. So I mentioned this figure, North Americans consume 1 million pounds of raw materials per year per person. 98 to 90% turns into waste, goes to the landfill. You can do things like you can substitute less expensive, more environmentally friendly materials. A classic example is fly ash concrete. So fly ash that is produced by cement kilns, rather than landfilling it, you mix it when you make concrete. It halves the amount of CO2 emissions that are produced in producing the concrete, and it's stronger and more resistant to corrosion. You reduce material use in energy and water inputs, you reduce reuse and recycle, and most importantly, you adopt a cradle-to-cradle philosophy, which means that you design your products so that they can be taken back at the end of life and broken down into their components, and those components can be reused. So for example, I mentioned Ray Anderson, who was influenced by the ecology of commerce. So they designed, the interface carpeting is made in squares. And the squares have a biomimicry design so that you can't really see, the eye doesn't notice the edge of one square and the start of the other, which means that if you have a high traffic area, you just remove the squares that are worn and put down new ones, and no one notices. You don't have to rip out the whole carpet, right? So, and they also design their carpentry, they take it back, and then they remanufacture the materials. And their goal is by 2030 that they will be net resource zero. So they will be able to do all their manufacturing using recyclates. But you have to be mindful about it and design your products that way, right? But it can be done. You can lower your operating costs by improving waste handling and energy efficiencies, conserving water. And a big one, which more and more companies are embracing, is telecommuting. It's actually much cheaper for companies when your employees telecommute. Why? Because you need less office space. Office space, particularly if you operate in the downtown, is very expensive. And you also can reduce business travel, which is also very expensive. So video conferencing is good for that. TELUS, for example, which is a fairly green company. I would say they're not dark green, but they're mid-green. But in their new, I used to work for them, so I know. In their new corporate head office, which is very nice, it's a LEED Platinum building. Many employees don't have offices anymore. They have a hot desk area, and people they work at home and they come in for meetings 2 or 3 days a week. And the employees love it, and they saved a lot of money on office costs. So also there are opportunities to increase revenue and market share. I'm a guy, so I love cars. I love fast cars. So one of my favorite examples is the Tesla, right? So they brought out the Tesla Roadster. That was their first car. 100% electric, 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 4 seconds. They now have a model that's got 4-wheel drive. It does 0 to 100 kilometers an hour in 2.6 seconds. And that's as fast as the fastest motorcycles. Okay. I mean, it's kind of useless. Where can you drive a car like that except on a road track? But, guys, we like that kind of thing. It has, operating costs are about 1/8 of a conventional car in terms of fuel and maintenance, so it's much cheaper to run. And today, Tesla's market cap eclipses GM's. So that's staggering. Like GM produces over millions of cars a year. Tesla only produces, well, now they're up to about, this year they're hoping to do about 100,000. But I mean, there's no comparison in terms of revenue or number of vehicles. But a lot of people believe, and I think they're right. I mean, I believe that Elon Musk is a genius equivalent, similar to in the same league as Steve Jobs of Apple, but he has single-handedly, well, that's not true. He's led a company that has advanced the mass adoption of electric vehicles by at least a decade, probably 2. Because he was so wealthy from PayPal and had so much credibility, he could raise the money. He could get deals with the U.S. government, like the U.S. government lent him $300 million so he could build the first Tesla factory in California. They wouldn't have done that to someone who didn't have his kind of credibility and stature, right? But he just demonstrated you could do it and that people wanted it, and so everybody else is now doing it much faster than they would otherwise do. So we owe him a debt of gratitude. And the stock market believes in him, and you can see that in the valuation of Tesla. The other thing I mentioned was license to operate. So it's literally beyond value or invaluable, because if you don't have it, you can't do business. So Northern Gateway, for example, couldn't get licensed to operate, and they were shut down. Trans Mountain, they've been blessed by the NEB and by the government, but they're still, they're not out of the woods yet. And then there's an example of a company called Harvest Power who took organic waste, and what they did is they used a technique called windrows. So they would pile the organic waste in kind of like dunes, and just let it sit there and rot. And it smelled awful, and people didn't like it, and they were eventually shut down by Metro Vancouver. So again, they lost their social license, and you're out of business. So Bob Willard has this model of what he calls the 5 stages of the sustainability journey. The first stage is pre-compliance. This is where you're blissfully ignorant of sustainability. You don't even think about it. And then the second stage is compliance, and usually companies are driven there because of regulations or legislation. So they have to do it, or they're going to be heavily fined, or their directors are going to end up in jail, or both. Then beyond compliance is where companies start to realize we can save money by eco-efficiencies, or we can avoid a PR crisis, or we can avoid regulation. Because any business person will tell you it's much better to be proactive, clean up your act, rather than be regulated. It's cheaper. And the fourth stage is integrated strategy. This is where a company has realized that actually there are long-term benefits, and so they are voluntarily doing it everywhere. An example of a company like that would be, well, TELUS is moving towards that. We'll talk about Nike, huh? Well, TELUS, for example, I mentioned telecommuting. They have invested in, they've done a big green power deal. So they invested in wind farms. So all of the power that they use, or equivalent amount of power to the power they use, is generated from renewable sources. A lot of companies have done that. Apple has done it, and so on. And then you have stage 5 companies, which are companies where you're doing it because it's the right thing to do. So you have a values-driven founder or CEO. So examples like Interface or Patagonia, Yves Chouinard is Van City, which is very much a values-driven organization. MEC. These are stage 5 organizations. So when I was doing consulting, I would ask my clients, where do you want to be? What are your goals? And within what time frame? 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. So an example of what I'm talking about how sustainability objectives force you to rethink how you do things. So the city of Surrey had a very visionary gentleman, Rob Costanzo, who was their director of waste disposal. And they had an opportunity to do things differently. So he said, and he sold his counsel on it, we're going to put in an organic waste facility. We're going to produce green gas and compost. And we're going to use the green gas to power our garbage trucks. And so they did it. Now the Surrey biofuel facility is up and running in Port Kells Industrial Park. It runs on the organic waste collected from 100,000 Surrey households. It produces biomethane, which is piped into Fortespecies grid, and then they draw it out where they actually fuel the garbage trucks. They planned in advance, so they had an opportunity to reissue the RFP for waste collection, and they specified that the garbage trucks had to run on compressed natural gas, so that they would be ready for when the biomethane was available. And this facility, which I was involved, which is why I know so much about it, produces organic compost. It produces ammonium nitrate, which is very good for fertilizing. It produces metals, because they're not only supposed to put organic waste in the green bin, but they also put other stuff in, of course, being people. So you get metals, so those are extracted, and they're sold and melted down, and they're useful. And shredded plastic, which goes to the concrete kilns, and they burn it. That's fuel. So 97% of waste by volume is recycled. It's the most efficient organic waste facility in North America right now. 115,000 tons a year it can handle. And it reduces the cost of waste collection for the city of Surrey by 25%. So they're saving $2.8 million a year for their citizens. So when you really rethink how you do things, you can actually reduce environmental impact, improve community impact, and save money. But it involves change. And we tend as a species to resist change, unfortunately. There's another concept called the circular economy. So in the UK, there's something called the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Ellen MacArthur is a multi-millionaire who decided to put her money to something useful. Remarkable woman. And so she created the Ellen MacArthur Foundation with the goal of accelerating the transition to a circular economy. A circular economy is one where you can see here the linear economy. You extract resources, you produce things, you distribute them, you consume them, and then they turn into waste and go into the landfill. Circular economy, you produce them, you distribute them, you consume them, you take them back, and they're recycled and reused again. So when you get into circular economy, you greatly diminish the amount of resource extraction activity. So it's basically an economy where it's restorative and regenerative by design, based on 3 key principles: designing out waste and pollution mindfully, keeping products and materials in use, and regenerating natural systems. Like we talked about all this damage earlier that's happening. So you actually have to consciously restore and regenerate the ecosystem. And there's a group of companies called the Circular Economy 100. And it's a program, it's pre-competitive, it's innovative. They get together and share their secret sauces about how can we transform our companies into being circular. And this is an initiative that's led by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Google it, it's amazing. I met her at a conference in California, Verge, that I go to every year. Very humble, non-assuming person, but doing great things. So some global sustainability leaders, Nike is a member of the CE 100, and 70% of their materials are recyclates already. So they're well along the road. For example, in 2017, where the statistic comes from, they had taken back 30 million shoes to be broken down and reused. Google is another C100 global partner, and they did analysis of their data centers. And of course, they have huge server farms that burn a prodigious amount of energy. And they figured out how, and they were also throwing them out prematurely. So they looked at how could they keep them in use longer, how could they then be resold and reused by other people, and how could they make them more efficiency. And now they're saving over $1 billion a year through energy efficiency. And even for Google, that's serious coin. And Walmart, now you wouldn't think of Walmart as being, but Sam Walton and his wife met Ellen MacArthur and her husband at some event, and she convinced them. She sold them on the concept of the circular economy, and so it changed the behavior of Walmart. And for example, they have a goal now of zero waste, having 100% landfill diversion, having 100% renewable energy, and greening their supply chain. And that's greening their supply chain is very significant, because Walmart has revenues that exceed the GDP of many countries, right? Like, so when they decide to do something, it has a huge impact. So in 2009, they announced the Walmart Sustainability Product Index, which is where they evaluate the sustainability of all of their products, and they publish it. Okay, you can go online, you can see it. And for example, a year later, P&G announced their long-term sustainability vision: 100% renewable energy for their plants, 100% renewable materials recycled, zero waste, and very importantly, they announced public targets, right? Because that's what counts, is when you announce publicly what you do and you report on it. Now, why do you think they did it? Well, Walmart represents 40% of their sales. And that's known in the sustainability business as the Walmart effect. And it's actually real. So basically, I mean, we do the same thing as individual purchasers when we consciously choose a greener product or service over a less green one. But when an organization the size of Walmart does it, it really accelerates the process, right? Yeah.
Just wondering why these corporations don't announce that. Because it's not just good press, but it's also something that people can then make choices about supporting.
I know it's odd, like McDonald's. McDonald's is a sustainability leader too. I was at Verge last year, and the chief sustainability officer was there, and he was telling about all the things they did. Like they wanted to use responsible, environmentally responsible, ecologically responsible fish. So they wanted sustainably farmed or harvested fish. And they were buying all their fish from Russia, and Russia refused to change their fishing habits. So they switched, and they bought all their fish from someone who was sustainable fish harvesting. And it cost them millions and millions of dollars more, but they never told anybody. I only learned about it because I was at the sustainability conference, and this guy was speaking about the things they've done. I guess it's because they think with their customers, doesn't resonate with them.
But they may get more customers because
they might. I don't know. I mean, that's.
I wouldn't go into a Walmart.
No, but
I might if I knew.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know the answer. But they're not doing it. They're not doing it for brand reasons. These companies, because they don't talk about it. But you're right. For certain clients, it would have a positive impact. Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating. But they also do it because companies this size have enough capital, they have the financial resources that they can take a long-term view. And any economist will tell you, well, most economists, 90%, that sustainability will pay off in the long run. If you're interested in maximizing your shareholder value over 25 years or 50 years or 100 years, it's obvious, because there is no business on a dead planet. But big companies have the ability, they have the money, they have the skilled staff, expert staff, they're not consumed with just surviving, so they can afford to take a long-term view, and they do. And that's what drives them to adopt these strategies. There's also an organization called the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, which also has a whole bunch of corporate heavyweights, so you would recognize the names, who are similarly committed to driving this change.
Well, if they want to get business, I mean, thinking of the millennials, because I've got several in my family.
Yes.
So, looking for change and wanting to change the culture.
Yes.
So being in their 30s, for example, 30s, early 40s, they would possibly, I mean, maybe people that are older know, but they may. So it's
well, this is why I think, yes, but I mean, it's driven by, I heard David Suzuki speak in 2004, and he made the point, and he was right then, and he's still right today, that we can vote with our pocketbooks.
Yeah.
If everybody chooses to start purchasing based on just selecting sustainable products over ones that aren't, companies' behaviors will change very quickly.
It hasn't yet, though.
But
Walmart is not, for example.
Well, but for example, if you go into Save-On, they have a significant organic section now,
Right.
at least in North Vancouver.
Right. And speaking of Save-On, they've come out with a package of 3 reusable vegetable bags for $3.49. It just hit the shelves in the produce department this week.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're anticipating the ban on single-use plastic, but it's much more reasonable cost than if you bought that somewhere else. So I've stocked up.
Yeah.
So I'm doing my best to change my behavior, so I always have one of those bags with me. And I understand they sold out the first day they put them out there.
Yeah. So there are these signs, but it's driven by customer demand.
Yeah.
So that's part of our responsibility. It's like politically, as a politician, you can only get so far ahead of the electorate, otherwise you don't get reelected the next time around. So this is why I think what GTEC is doing is so important. Arden said the back there, but his vision is to create support for environmental